From Simon Fraser University, I'm Saraan Jiwani, and this is The Curiosity. Today's episode is a heavy one. It's a journey of self-reflection, a journey of understanding my race, and a journey of figuring out my positionality as a South Asian immigrant subsiding in Canada. In today's podcast, I seek to answer the overarching question: how does media go about constructing a race, and how does this impact the way I view myself as a racialized individual? The focus of my text will be American cinema, consisting of TV shows and films. I ask a few key questions. How did I come to learn that I'm brown? How do the theories of othering and racial consciousness help bring to light things that are often unseen but have larger implications? And lastly, what are the ways American cinema portrays South Asian characters? Before I begin, here's a disclaimer. In this podcast, I use the term Indians to represent a part of the South Asian community or people from India, and not indigenous communities or Native Americans. Let me take you back all the way to 2015. Imagine an 18-year-old kid from India who just finished high school and traveled 18,000 kilometers to Canada to attend university. This is the first time he has lived abroad for longer than 2 weeks. He feels that he's ready for what's to come and thinks that he'll be able to adjust with ease. He tells himself, "I've gone to a few different countries for vacations. I've watched a lot of American TV shows and films. I've seen other nationalities and know about different cultures. So I think I'm basically ready." But as every tale has a twist, so did this one. This Indian kid had no idea what he was getting into, and after spending some time in Canada, he has this awakening. He realizes that there are some disparities in the way he sees his own race, and starts questioning his own identity. If you haven't guessed who this kid already is, spoiler alert, it's me. The reality is, when I came to Canada, started university, and made new friends, I still had several assumptions unanswered. These assumptions were about what the people in Canada were like, especially the South Asians. When I compared myself to them, I slowly realized that I couldn't relate to many issues that they faced. And the biggest challenge was understanding several nuances of racism faced by South Asians. I'm not trying to sound ignorant, but I couldn't understand why certain people found certain topics offensive. I asked myself, what is wrong with being associated with curry? Why is brown voice or racialized Indian accents insulting and not just humorous like in the films? And why is stereotyping such a big deal anyway? This made me question my own positionality as an Indian. Am I really that desensitized? And how racially woke or racially conscious am I really about my race and culture? Now that I look back, I can understand why I thought the way I did. And it all boils down to the power of media and its ability to construct a race. I knew I had a long journey ahead of me and a lot to learn about South Asians in Canada. But now in retrospect, I've come to realize that my awareness of race was in the form of double consciousness. In the article The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois talks about how he experiences racial consciousness as a black man in America. He remarks, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. It's this constant battle with himself that Du Bois goes through to understand his place in society and how his consciousness differs from the others. This struggle is rather internalized, largely because the African American community was powerless and voiceless for the longest time in history to bring forward their perspectives and beliefs. He uses the words striving double aim to describe his longing to attain self conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better, truer self. He hopes to strike a balance between African and American culture to embrace both equally rather than acquiring one over the other. The strive for equality is present throughout Du Bois's writing, and that he hopes to be a co worker in the kingdom of culture. This idea of double consciousness resonates with me, but in a slightly different manner. I find myself at crossroads where I must alter my perspectives and consciousness to fit the standards that best fit the culture here, and so that my differences don't overshadow my similarities. However, coming from India, these differences cannot be ignored, and this has had a big impact on my racial consciousness. Let me tell you a little bit about India. This country is packed with over 1.35 billion people. Let me repeat that, 1.35 billion. That is huge. And what's more interesting about India is that it is only packed with Indians and no other nationalities. I did not grow up with a diverse multicultural group of friends. I grew up with people just like me. So when you talk about racism, there is not much of racism that I heard or experienced growing up. Inequality and unrest lie more when we talk about class, religion, color, or economic status, but not amongst different races in India. And that's where my experience differed. This idea of my lived experience in India made it difficult for me to understand the sentiments of racism faced in South Asians in Canada. This double consciousness, where I see myself and my race as an outcome of what I believe is to be true in comparison to what others believe is true. The assumptions that I previously mentioned about South Asians were also skewed by American TV shows and films I grew up watching. A large part of my teenage years was spent watching these media texts that consisted of characters that could be categorized as an outcome of othering. Miles and Brown, in The Representation of the Other, point out that in the process of categorizing people through images and beliefs, we create a version of the self and the other. They also point out that the way we represent others is an important part of how we define ourselves. The characteristics of others contrast the characteristics of the self, and the process of othering largely relies on how we define our own characteristics. In today's time, films in specific can be considered a rich and influential source of imagery that successfully create a sense of self and other. Films tell stories that are consumed by masses and that are spread over several racial communities. The way media outlets represent a race can deeply affect the way we view our races as well. To represent South Asians in a certain way that fills the casting agenda, films and TV shows use several techniques, one of which is the use of brown voice or the Indian accent.
I think the next time I have to speak to a call center in India, I'm going to try using an American accent.
Why?
Because when I use my regular voice, I feel like I'm making fun of them.
That's ridiculous. Not to mention, your American accent is terrible.
Dude, my accent is brilliant. Hey, my Snow White American friends, let's put some cow meat on the barbecue and eat it until we're all obese.
This is what you sound like. I think I'm talking in an American accent, but it really sounds like I'm wearing a set of giant dentures.
Sheldon, do I really sound like that?
Tell him he sounds like that.
The excerpt you heard was from the long-running comedy show, The Big Bang Theory. Raj, played by Kunal Nair, is having a conversation with his friend Howard about his Indian accent and sarcastically remarks on how his accent could be found offensive by Indians at call centers. Shilpa Dev in the article Racial Accents, Hollywood Casting, and Asian American Studies describes the brown voice as the act of speaking in an accented English associated with Indian national and immigrants, and is a combination of linguistic and phonetic markers that include stress points on particular words, cultural references, and words out of order. She further points out how the accent is representative of the stereotypical roles that have enjoyed longevity and commercial success. It also acts as a cultural currency and creates an image of how Indian Americans should act and sound like, further leading to normalization. Another technique that I've also personally seen in a lot of films and TV shows is the 3 degrees of ethnicity of South Asian characters described by Bhumi Thackeray. These consist of the forever foreigner, the model minority, and the assimilated American. The forever foreigner paints South Asian characters like Apu from The Simpsons who have stereotypical representations such as the accent, the head tilt, and who are seen as immigrants regardless of their level of assimilation. They also represent them as overly ethnic that helps maintain the immigrant and foreigner image. Raj from The Big Bang fits this description really well. Another TV show that comes in my mind which has a similar character is Kelly from The Office. Even though she does not communicate or talk in the stereotypical fashion, Michael's perspective of Kelly seems to fit the description of the forever foreigner. Michael fails to separate Kelly from her Indian origins, and the TV show bases Kelly in a stereotypical Indian limelight. Listen to how Michael describes Kelly and the festival of Diwali.
Tonight, one of our most ethnic co-workers, Kelly, has invited us all to a Diwali celebration put on by her community. What is Diwali, you may ask? Well, to have Kelly explain it,
It's, I love blah, blah, blah. It's so super fun, and it's gonna be great.
a lot of gods with unpronounceable names. 20 minutes later, you find out that it's essentially a Hindu Halloween.
Well, sorry, Michael, but it isn't just a Hindu Halloween. It's much more. Let's take a listen to another example. Here, Michael is trying to describe an Indian person to Kelly.
Kelly, how are you?
I had the longest meeting.
Oh, welcome to my convenience store. Would you like some googie googie? Oh, I have some very delicious googie googie, only 99 cents plus tax. Try my googie googie. Try my googie googie. Try my googie googie. Try my...
If you weren't able to guess it, yes, that was Kelly slapping Michael. As much as I love the TV show, I do feel that there were a lot of problematic representation of the South Asian community, and Kelly's character was used as a forever foreigner. The 2nd degree of ethnicity is the model minority, which paints South Asians in the positive light, where the group is assumed to be intelligent and successful. It also falsely proposes a racial hierarchy that is genetic. A notable example is Kevin, the therapist from How I Met Your Mother, which is played by Kalpen, who is presumed to be smart due to his ethnicity. Model minority characters like Kevin can further be tied to colorblindedness, where if the minorities are able to act and achieve a somewhat high social status, like the white majority, their race is no longer an issue. However, in using the term colorblindedness, it negates and fails to acknowledge the previous injustices, inequalities, trauma, and intergeneration experiences that have been faced by the community. The last degree of ethnicity is the assimilated American, where characters are portrayed similar to white characters who have an absence of overtly ethnic representations. These characters embody a personality that feels distant to the South Asian culture. Taking the example of Kalpan again, this South Asian actor plays the role of Kumar in the comedic film series Harold and Kumar, playing a rather boyish role and embodying an assimilated American. Kalpan plays two distinct roles in two different films and TV shows. However, his character fits in perfectly with 2 out of 3 degrees of ethnicities, displaying the lack of representation of the South Asian nationality in American cinema. When I look back at myself from 2015, the kid who arrived to Canada with no solid knowledge about his own race, I now understand why I felt like an outsider, why I experienced my racial consciousness in the form of double consciousness. I grew up watching American cinema that served as the only source of information about South Asians in the West. I was looking at my own race through the lens of American media outlets that fed me information and told me to think a certain way. It constructed this facade of a South Asian race that I used as a reference when I came to Canada. It told me to find humor in the brown accent. It showed me stereotypical characters that conveniently fit the storyline for commercial success, characters that were the other to an American self. In the last 5 years, I've realized that my understanding of my race is rather flawed, and I'm still on a journey to correct that.